Well, it's interesting. My dad has 5 brothers, and they went to Pocatello, Idaho, and my dad and his younger brother found 2 girls, 2 Mormon girls, and they all fell in love, and they got married. My dad was born, or he was 18 when he married my mother, and my mother was 16 when she was married to him. My dad was born on January 1st, 1910. My mother was born January 3rd, 1912. I was born January 14th, 1941. I have a sister. She was the firstborn. Wonderful. I miss her. She's already passed away. She was born in 1929. And then I had a brother. He was born in October of 1938. 9 years between my sister and my brother. My mother, shortly after Donna May is my sister's name, was born, she contracted a childhood disease known as scarlet fever. It was very hard on her. I nearly lost our mother at that time. Penicillin wasn't even available yet. She was 19 years old. She struggled, but she made it. But when my brother was born 9 years later, the doctor told her that she shouldn't have any more children because she had an enlarged heart, and they thought that it would be too hard for her, and she might even die at birth, giving birth. Medical opinion changed over the years, and so 9 years later, my brother was born, and my parents were ecstatic. Tragedy hit moments later. My brother passed away. The medical information we received that his lungs weren't fully developed. The real truth of the matter is, I believe, he had a broken neck. When mother was giving birth, the baby was breeching, and the doctor was not there, and the procedure at that time, I guess, was push the baby back. And so that happened several times. And so he didn't live long after that. So it was really sad on my parents, so difficult. I was born 3 years later, and they were absolutely ecstatic because there was another child, boy, in the family. And my sister became my guardian angel. She was 11 years older than I, and she would push me around in the buggy around Pocatello, the streets that we lived on. Anyway, that's kind of where my family is, and it was a loving family. My dad was a butcher. Prior to that, he and his younger brother, out of the 5, they became taxi cab drivers. They had their own company. And then Dad became a butcher. And then after Dad was a butcher, he had all of his brothers come, and he taught them how to be a butcher, and he had his own little shop in the market. My dad, in their early marriage, indicated was a taxi driver along with his brother. He was probably 19, and his brother was 17. The other brothers were doing different things. They were younger. There was an older brother, but he was not in the picture as far as in the same area. We lived in Pocatello, Idaho. And after the taxi business really didn't go well, there really wasn't need for a taxi in old Pocatello at that point. He decided he wanted to become a butcher, so he went and got some training and got his license to be a butcher, and he bought a butcher shop in a local grocery store in Pocatello. And I have a picture of him in that butcher shop in 1938. And he loved it. And then as his brothers were in and out of town, whatever, they didn't have work, and so he says, "Come to the butcher shop. I'll teach you how to be a butcher." And so they were all there off and on through the first probably 8 to 10 years there in Pocatello, Idaho. My dad was very gregarious. He loved to tell stories. All of his brothers called him Chief because he was the one that was coming up with the ideas and the things that they wanted to do. I can tell you that as my dad grew, he loved to be an inventor. He loved being a salesman. So he left being a butcher and first started out by being a salesman for beet harvesters. And then and that was in Ogden. And then finally he saw a little tractor, four-wheel drive tractor, and it was just used in gardens. And he had the idea, I want to make a full-blown balloon tire tractor to be in competition with the Caterpillar with its steel tracks. And so he got together with his brothers, and they huddled and they talked about it, and they got together with an engineer, and they put one together. And he ended up in Stockton, California, with a manufacturer that made well over 300 of those tractors. And he was doing really well. And they had a tractor shop called the Crockett Brothers. And everything was going really well. In fact, one day he was invited by the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. to come and demonstrate this tractor. The Navy had a particular desire to have this tractor because of its balloon tires on an aircraft carrier to move equipment and planes around. So he went to demonstrate this tractor, and right in the middle of his demonstration, one of the axles broke on the tractor. And he saw the generals eventually all walking out from the stands, and it ended up that the tractor business fell apart. And what happened, we find out later, was that the manufacturer was putting in inferior pieces of equipment or whatever for the tractor, and it didn't hold up. And it ended up, then he went into bankruptcy, and they had 100 tractors out on the manufacturing lot, and Mexico came and bought all of those tractors. And so there's still some around today. I've noticed on the internet that you can still find, it's called the Power Horse tractor. Anyway, that was my dad. And finally, in the end, he went into real estate and contracted cancer. I was out in the mission field, and then by the time we got home, he hadn't learned that he had cancer yet. He went to the doctor, and the doctor says it's full-blown, and he died within 12 weeks after I'd returned from my mission. It was really hard because we were extremely close, and our family was a hugging family, a kissing family, and all of his brothers were very close to me. They loved me, and I think part of it was because they knew that Mom and Dad had lost their first son, and so here I was, and so they all rallied around me. So that's kind of the early history. My mother was very quiet, loving, wonderful cook. After my dad passed away, she ended up becoming head cook at a convalescent hospital for several years, and she lived 20 years after my dad's passing. Anyway, great family, and a lovely sister, and I look forward to meeting my brother someday. When I was about 4.5 years old, my great-grandmother was still alive, and my mother wanted to go see her grandmother, and so they took me with them. And she lived in Arbin Valley, which was just a little ways out of Pocatello, Idaho, next to the Indian reservation, Fort Hall it was. And she lived in a log cabin, a log cabin. She had no running water. She had an outhouse in the back. Around her house was sagebrush and dirt, a tree or two, and off we went. And I remember driving into this wilderness and sagebrush and pulled in front of her log cabin, and she came out to greet us. She was about 90 years old. She had an electric light bulb in her front room and kitchen area, and a light bulb in each of the 2 bedrooms in her log cabin. Her brothers were living with them. Al and Alfred was their name. They were a hoot. They were both pretty well deaf, and you couldn't hear, or they couldn't hear very well. And so they had gone out, apparently, and got horns off of a bull. I don't know how I don't know if they, anyway, they had them. And they cut the ends off of the bull horns, and they would hold the horn up to their ear, and then when you wanted to speak to them, you'd walk over and speak at the large end, and it really worked quite well. They could hear. So one of the early hearing aids, I guess you would say. Anyway, it was while there, and Grandma had a well right next to her house for drinking water. When we were there visiting, my mother said to me, "Would you go out to the car and get the package that I forgot to bring?" Sure, I was excited, and so ran out the door, and unbeknownst to me, a snake had slithered underneath our car and was in the shade. I'm sure he was just resting, no big deal. But I ran out to the car, opened the car, jumped into the car, and I'm sure the car was being jiggled around, and the snake must have said to himself, "I think I better get out from underneath this car." And so it started to slither out from underneath the car just as I had picked up the package, and I jumped out of the car and I landed directly on that snake. And the snake wrapped around my foot, and I was petrified. I couldn't breathe. I'm sure the goose flesh was sticking up all over me, and my heart was pounding. And the snake was trying to get out from under my foot, and so it was swinging around, and it would wrap around my leg, then it would unwrap, and then it was anyway. Finally, it got away and it slithered. I couldn't breathe. And finally, when I finally got control to where I could breathe, I let out this horrible scream. Ah! And my grandmother and my mom and dad come running out of the cabin. "What happened? What happened?" And I finally was able to say, it took me a moment, I said, "Snake!" And my grandmother just was, for a moment, was petrified. She thought that maybe I had stepped on a rattlesnake or something, and so she ran over to me and looked at my leg to see if I had any bites, and I didn't. And she says, "What did it look like?" And I didn't know. The only thing I said was, "Big!" and then after she calmed down, or I calmed down again, she says, "What color was it?" And I thought, and I said it was black and white. And then she let out a, "Oh." And what it was, I stepped on her king snake, and the king snake was her pet. And the pet kept the rattlesnakes away from her cabin. A king snake, in a battle between a rattlesnake and a king snake, a king snake will always win. It is immune to the poisonous venom of snakes, and it would grab a rattlesnake just behind its head with its jaws, and then it would wrap around its body around the rattlesnake, and it had a powerful muscular body, and it would just squeeze until the snake would die. And then it would go, and it would also keep the rats and the mice away from the cabin. So that was my first experience as a little boy. It wasn't that I was scared, I was petrified. It was the worst feeling. I can feel it. And when I was later on in life, I went into the kitchen out on our little place. I opened up the fridge, and there was a little green snake that had come into the house, and it was by the refrigerator. And that phobia, if you will, came right back to me from the time I was just a little boy. As I look back at it over the years, I think Heavenly Father, He loves me. I know He does. He loves all of His children, but He had something in mind for me, and I had to go through a learning experience early in life to understand real fear, because I've had occasions in my life where fear has come into various experiences in my life. And that experience that I had in realizing that Heavenly Father put a king snake, which was my grandmother's pet, to step on rather than a rattlesnake, and getting bit several times. And so I give my thanks to Heavenly Father for giving me the experience, even though I was petrified with fear almost to where I felt like I wasn't even going to survive. I had another experience that was a thrill, a happy occasion, and I was maybe 6 years old. Where Dad was still a butcher in the butcher shop, and the butcher shop, or the store, was next to the Pocatello railroad yard. And the railroad yard in Pocatello was huge because it was the crossroads to the west. Trains coming in from the west would then hit that yard, and then they would divide and go northeast or northwest and west and down to the south. Anyway, there was a little park next to, about a block away, and it was right next to a major railroad track. When I was about 6 years old, I was allowed to go to that park with my friends, and we would play. And it was on this first occasion that I had this experience with what I called this monster, beautiful beast. Coming down the track was this big, black, steam locomotive, huge, and it was chugga-lugga, 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 and the steam was coming out of the sties, and the smoke was coming. And then as it would get close, we would all stop and lean against the fence, and we would do this thing with our hands, and oftentimes the engineer would let loose with a, and it was so loud. We would scream, and I'd hold my ears. I couldn't even hear myself screaming, and it was... Anyway, I fell in love with trains, and I said to myself as I was growing, someday I'm going to be a locomotive driver for those big trains. I have a grandson who's now serving out in the mission, and he has that same love for those trains. And so he and I are able to share some feelings. What's the name of that? Oh, Big Boy. It's one of those steam engines back in the 40s, and it came through Salt Lake and this area, and he was there to see it as it came through. Anyway, so there's a little bind between that grandson and I as it comes to trains. As I got older, I needed to learn the appreciation of work. I was a spoiled little boy. I'm sure I was, because my parents were so grateful to have a son that lived that I'm sure that they overprotected me. So anyway, my Uncle Bob, who had served in the Army during World War II, became a dairyman. And my dad and my Uncle Bob, his brother, says, my boy needs to learn to work. And he says, bring him on up during the summer and I'll teach him how to work. It was the greatest experience of my life. I learned how to milk a cow. I learned how to bale hay with a baler and to take hay bales and throw them up on the top of a wagon. I learned to feed the pigs. I learned to gather eggs for the chickens, feed the rabbits. One of the things that was really unique was that every time my Aunt Jane would cook breakfast for us, she would have something that was far beyond my ability to even think about ever eating. But we'd go out bullfrog hunting, and we'd bring the frogs back, kill them, hit them over the head, skin them, and then she'd cut the legs off, and we would have deep-fried frog legs to eat. And then she would cook up liver was more for dinner, but for breakfast we would get heart, we would get kidneys, we would get cow brains. I didn't eat the cow brains very much. I took a bite, but it was emotionally too much for me to be cow brains. And these frog legs. Then we'd have homemade ice cream, and I would learn to churn that by hand. And then the brothers would all come with their families in October, and we would slaughter animals for the freezer. For we have a year of meat in the freezer. And I remember this one year, my Uncle Bob had bought 50 chickens, and we were going to slaughter all the chickens on that given day. And that was my first experience to even be around an animal that was going to be killed. And instead of chopping off their heads, my uncle says, come here, Rod, here's how you do it. He says, you take your two fingers like this, and you put it around the neck of the chicken, and you hold it off to the side, and you start swinging the chicken like this, and swing it and pop his head off. I said, what? And it's the way we do it, and it's faster, and we don't have to get the axe and try to chop all the heads off. So I ended up, and we had chickens running with their heads off. You've heard the old saying, chickens with your head cut off. Anyway, they were running around. Blood was everywhere. Anyway, that was my first experience with that on the farm. The other experience I had on the farm was all the brothers got together and they bought a Hereford steer. And they raised it and fed it and got it big. And I fed it and rubbed its nose. I really turned to love this steer. And then I had the experience of the slaughter of that Hereford. They put it into a stanchion, and my uncle had a rifle, don't know what the caliber, maybe a .22. And he took the rifle, he put it to the head, and I was standing there watching, and boom, he shot it, and the Hereford fell down, and they got him out of the stanchion, put chains, and pulled him up high into the barn. And then all the brothers, all five, they because of the butcher training they had, they were taking off the hide and pulling. And I was watching all of this. I was getting sick to my stomach. And then finally they slit down the midsection, and all of the innards fall down to onto the ground. Anyway, I learned a lot at my Uncle Bob's on that ranch. Then, with all of that learning, and that which was very helpful to me to learn what it is to be that you didn't go to the store and buy a chicken, that you had to go out and kill the chicken and take the feathers off the chicken. Oh, anyway, I had to learn all that. When I was about between 11 and 12 in October, the brothers would come with their families and we'd go on pheasant hunts. My Uncle Bob had a big field full of field corn, silage kind of corn, and there were lots of pheasants. My dad bought me a 410 shotgun. A 410 is the smallest shotgun that they make. And it was a single shot. And I said, how come a single shot, Dad? Son, when you go pheasant hunting, you're going to have time for one shot. So you got to make it count. And the 410, that's just the beginning for you. So I bought you this 410. I said, okay. So we went on my first hunt with my family and cousins. And it finally came and they would take turns. They said, if the pheasant's near you, we'll hold back and you take the shot. And so we'd walk closer and the pheasant would fly up. And one time, it was my time. I had the single shot, it was ready to go. It flew and I took it up, took an aim, boom, I shot. I hit it. And I saw, but it didn't kill it right off. And its legs dropped and it went down into the corn mesh. My uncle says, go get him. So I ran and I got to him and I looked down and it was still alive and it was staring at me. And I said, what do I do? And I didn't know what to do. I opened up the breech of my single shot, took a shell out, pulled out the older, put the new one in, closed the lock, took my shotgun, pointed it at this pheasant, blew the pheasant apart. My uncle come trotting over and he said, Rod, what did you do? I said, well, it was still alive. And he says, well, why didn't you just reach down and wring its neck? I didn't want to tell him I was scared to do that. But I just said, I didn't think of it, so I shot it. And he says, well, there's nothing left of the pheasant. You blew it apart. He says, pick it up and put it in your pack. We'll see what we can salvage from it. That was my first hunt. I later became very proficient as a pheasant hunter, still using my 410. Then I graduated to a 20 gauge, to a 16 gauge, and then to a 12 gauge. And each gauge is a more powerful shotgun. But then we went to duck hunting and goose, hunting geese. And then using my 410, I would hunt quail and jackrabbits, all out there on my uncle's farm. And my grandfather had a duck pond, and so the ducks were there. Anyway, learning for me, all of it. I could feel like the Lord was teaching me some things about life and things in my future those things I needed to know about. First off, one of the things that I learned that animals, domestic, wild animals, whatever, Heavenly Father put them on this earth, and man was free to hunt and to use animals to eat, but meat was to be eaten sparingly, according to the scriptures that I grew up with. But I had to learn that when I went to the grocery store to buy milk, I had to learn that it came from the milking of a cow. When I went to buy eggs, it had to come from the laying of eggs by chickens out on a farm. And when I wanted a steak or ribs or something, I learned that you have to kill that animal. And so you need to understand that when you go to the store and you buy meat, that there was an animal that was butchered to bring that about, but it was okay as long as you ate them sparingly and didn't go out to kill animals just for the sport of killing animals. And so I learned very much to respect animals. Earlier in life, when I had a BB gun, I'd go out and shoot sparrows or little blackbirds out on the telephone lines, and I had no thought about, not so big deal. So I had to learn to respect life, and when you shoot or butcher an animal, it's because it's something that you need, and that it was to feed your family. So those were the, and then working on the farm, baling the hay and all of that. The animals can't live if you don't feed them, and you can't just go around and pet them. You got to go out and get the hay and load it up and bring it home. We'll throw the hay out for the animals to eat, and slop for the pigs to eat, and grain for the chickens to pick on. So that was a great learning experience for me, and I needed that, because in this little town that I grew up in, well, I had the trains that kept me happy. When my cousin and I, Tom, we're like brothers. He's still alive. We're 6 months in difference. And my dad and his father were very close, and so we became very close. We were in the dairy. We were watching, Uncle Bob gave us a pail of water and a wash rag, and we were to go around as the cows were into the stanchions, and we would wipe the teats on it to get it ready for the milkers. And we had finished that, and my cousin Tom was walking just ahead of me, and my Uncle Bob was leaning down, and he was milking a very ornery critter, cow. In fact, my Uncle Bob called it Crazy Horse. And so he was milking it by hand, and as my cousin Tom walked by, the cow kicked out and hit my cousin and knocked him into the barn wall. And my uncle became so upset at that particular moment. And my Uncle Bob was a big man, strong, and he doubled up his fist and he went boom, right into the stomach of that cow. And I heard the thud, and at the same moment I heard this, whoa, and the cow's legs, all four legs, started to spread. It didn't go all the way down, but it spread out. And that was a thing in my mind that I'll never forget, is the sound of that cow and how my uncle whopped it. Now, he could have killed that cow, I suppose, but he was so upset at that moment when he slugged that cow. Anyway, my cousin was fine. He had a bruise on his thigh where the cow had kicked him. When I was a young boy growing up, by the time I was ready for the 4th grade, my dad and mom says, "Why don't you play an instrument?" I didn't want to play a piano. Some of my cousins were learning to play piano, and I says, "I don't want to do that." And he said, "Well, about getting into a band? Would you like to?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I might like that." And so I decided I was going to play a trumpet. So starting in the 4th grade, I started lessons at elementary school, and my dad bought me an old used trumpet, and I played that trumpet and all the way through elementary school and junior high school, and finally my dad bought me a brand new trumpet called the King. Oh, I love that trumpet. And I entered the high school band. And all of my close friends were in the band, and I remember we played in concerts and we marched, and it was fun. My closest friend was a tuba player, and he was about 5'6", weighed about 240 pounds, and he carried his big tuba on his back around him. And one day when we were having a big field day or a homecoming game, the city of Manteca, where I was now living, bought a brand new ambulance, and they wanted to show that off at the ball game. And so they went to the band teacher and they said, "Could you take a couple of your students, and while they're starting to march off the field, have them get like they were really sick or something, and have them fall down out there on the field?" And so he came to my friend, the tuba player, and me, the trumpet player, and said, "Would you boys do that for us?" "Sure, I'd love to do that." So, sure enough, out onto the field, and the ambulance was off to the side. And as we were marching off, my friend, he was the first, carrying this big tuba. He started weaving, and he fell down with his tuba, and I fell down. The problem of all of that was they didn't tell the principal at the high school. They didn't tell anybody in the stands what was about to take place. So when we fell down, you could hear from the audience this sound. There was a doctor in the audience, and he jumped up and he ran down out of the stands and was running in the field, but they caught him before he got out to us, and says, "It's just a stunt. It's just we want to show off our fire engine," or excuse me, the ambulance. The ambulance came out and they brought the stretchers, and the newspaper guy was in town, and he ran out, and as they were putting me on the stretcher, he took a picture of that, and it showed up in the morning paper the next day. My band teacher got in trouble, and the ambulance people got in trouble with the mayor, and my friend and I, we just loved it. We had such great fun. It was, anyway. So that was the experience with my band. After I graduated, I gave up my trumpet and saved it. And one of my sons played trumpet, and one of my grandsons played trumpet, the same trumpet that I had played with. And so it's a good history. I enjoyed that.